first on the list of the impossible ports is none other than CD Projekt Red's The Witcher 3. I think this is perhaps more than most of the games in this list, one of those games that at the launch of the Switch felt like it truly was something that was beyond the reach of what this little handheld could possibly produce. After all, The Witcher 3 is known for its vast, beautiful open world, and when it launched on PlayStation 4 and Xbox One many years ago, it did not run well. It struggled to even reach a consistent 30 frames per second on those machines. But CD Projekt Red continued to work at it, and thanks to a talented porting studio, we were able to see this game come to life on Nintendo's hardware. So, Oliver, we looked at this game, I think it's been 4 years almost.
5 years,
since it
I
released.
think.
5 years? 2019, actually, yeah. 5 years since this port arrived, and looking at it again here today, I gotta say, as someone that finally played all the way through The Witcher 3, I feel like this port manages to really capture the essence of what that game brings to the table.
Yeah, there are if you go through the list of cutbacks is kind of it's a long list. Like if you look at the LUTs, the foliage rendering, the shadows, obviously rendering resolution, all those things are cut back. But I think the key here is that it does look in broad strokes a lot like the last gen console version of the game. It is a version clearly of The Witcher 3. Most of the rendering features, key rendering features and technologies are still here. There's still some great looking individual effects, like I think the water looks fantastic. I think the way the environment comes together can be quite compelling. Obviously the fact that it's running at low resolutions does give the game a bit of less of an elegant look than you would have seen on the other consoles.
Sure.
But the fact that it's just running on a Switch, they had a tremendously difficult time, I think, especially with the RAM allotment on Switch and a lot of difficult problems with that. But it's still it's just a really impressive looking port in the end. And getting a game like this that's so big, that has so much content, has this gigantic open world with enormous landscapes that stretch out far into the distance, running in the palm of your hand, it's really quite something, I think.
And yeah, I think palm of the hand is where it shines the most. The portable mode is definitely significantly better looking to my eyes, especially when played on the Switch OLED, just
Absolutely.
because the nature of that screen and its size really helps make it stand out. When played on docked, the sacrifices become a lot more obvious. But as you say, I feel like what they really did here is they examined all the different ways that they could scale it back without compromising the overall vision of the game, right? And that's one of the keys to this entire category, is figuring out which things you can cut without spoiling the look of the game. And yeah, like you said, when you look at that whole list, it sounds bad, but in reality, it holds up surprisingly well. Even the performance is pretty acceptable outside of, when you're running around like Novigrad or something where it does seem to chug, but that was also the case on last gen platforms.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And they improved that over time and added some visual options in the menus. Like there's toggles for anti-aliasing and bloom and a couple other things I believe in there as well. To help you hopefully get a little bit more performance. And indeed, with a modded Switch overclocked, you can push it to I've seen people go for 60 FPS and stuff like this. It's quite impressive.
Indeed. So with that said, that's the number one on our list. Let's get to the next one. Next on our list then is, I would say, one of my favorite games of last generation, and one that I covered even before it released in the West, actually. That's how excited I was for it. It was NieR Automata. Which is an insane, crazy action adventure game that turns a lot of game concepts on its head and goes to some very interesting places, especially once you start getting into the multiple endings and really discovering what's going on. Very, very memorable experience. It launched first on PlayStation 4, had some PS4 Pro support, which basically just improved the frame rate and slightly bumped the resolution. And then it came to Xbox One, and if you played it on a regular Xbox One, honestly, the experience wasn't great. The actual performance level was largely often below 60, and this was a 60 FPS target game. So when it was announced that it was coming to the Switch, courtesy of Virtuous, I was very skeptical because, one, 60 FPS felt like it was off the table, right? Especially given how Xbox One S performs. And I was right. 60 FPS was off the table. But instead of trying to go for a very unstable Xbox One S style presentation, they instead decided to cap it down at 30 FPS and focus on delivering what looks basically like a very comparable, visually comparable version of NieR Automata. And I think, was it you that did the video on this, Oliver?
I did back about
Right,
years
right.
ago now.
It's been a while. But yeah, so you were also impressed with it.
I was very impressed. Like you said, NieR Automata is one of the most inventive, creative, fun, last generation games. It's just a super compelling title that I was excited to look at on Switch. The hits here are kind of interesting. So you get some of the usual simplifications in terms of how they're actually delivering this title, like lower res textures with fewer layers, lower res textures for things like foliage. They make some interesting cuts, like the 3D polygonal grass in the original is just replaced with alpha tested foliage, which it looks fine. It doesn't really look worse necessarily. It kind of looks different. It certainly has less aliasing, and it's just a different approach and an interesting decision. Some of the indirect lighting is simplified. Some of the geometric detail in the environments is gone, like when you would have seen little piles of rocks and things like that. It's been cut back considerably. But in broad strokes, it looks very similar, and it's not like the original game is pushing crazy lighting technology or like screen space reflections or anything like that we usually see cut out. It basically looks quite similar to this effort, I would say, and in broad strokes is a very comparable looking game. But I think the key detail here to me that's interesting comes down to anti-aliasing, which is that the Switch actually has it.
Yeah, exactly.
Unlike the Xbox One version, like the PlayStation 4 version, I think unlike all console versions of the game,
Yep.
it sort of looks post-processy, but it has some TAA style like jittering issues. I'm not totally sure what they were doing at the time. I also counted some low-res edges. I think they might be doing some kind of reconstruction. It's very bizarre, but it's interesting, and it certainly looks cleaner than the last-gen console versions like the Xbox One version. And the last note here I'd say is that frame rate wise, it does target 30 FPS. It does stick to that target mostly. It does drop a bit towards later stages. It's mostly pretty good, but I think in common with one or two other games on this list, the Xbox One version was targeting 60 FPS. It was just not capable of that. It was like often 40 FPS, often 50 FPS. Here, this is actually doing a better job overall of sticking to its frame rate target, which I think is admirable for a console like the Switch. Obviously, it's not as powerful as an Xbox One, but it's putting it in a good performance, delivering a comparable visual experience at a reasonably stable frame rate. I mean, it's a good experience for sure.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. And I really like some of those decisions they made. Like you mentioned the grass, switching to sort of like billboarded textures like that versus the modeled out grass blades. In a way, it can look better at points. I mean, it is decidedly different, but that original grass design meant that you get a lot of aliasing issues, especially at lower resolutions.
You need like
poor
TAA.
or no. Yeah, you need TAA for that, right? So it just ends up looking messy and noisy. So on Switch, it somehow feels a little bit cleaner overall. So, yeah, it's by and large, this is one of those ports where you're just like, dang, this turned out really, really well. And it's quite a playable version of NieR. So Absolutely. I'm glad this happened. So good job on the porting team. But next up, another actually Japanese game. All right, next game on the list is, in fact, my game of the year from 2019. It is Ace Combat 7. I absolutely loved Ace Combat 7. I've long loved Ace Combat. I feel like Ace Combat in some ways is like what Forza Horizon has become for the driving genre, where it's like there are sim-like elements to certain foundational bits in the game in the gameplay, but fundamentally it's very much arcadey. But this has a very different atmosphere, of course, and it's just the thrill of flying through the skies with amazing music, like crazy events happening, and just the variety of the missions and the things that happen during those missions. It's just unbelievable. And plus, one of those last missions, that main theme song is just unbelievable. It gives you goosebumps every time you experience that moment. But this is also an Unreal Engine 4 game, like most of Namco's output over the last generation. And similar to NieR, this game had some issues on the original Xbox One in terms of hitting its performance targets. Yes. And as a result, there was, again, some concern that this wouldn't translate well to Switch, especially because, well, frankly, Unreal Engine 4 games are very, I would say, largely kind of spotty on the Switch. Unless you put a lot of special effort into optimizing it for the Switch, you end up with a game that, frankly, looks significantly worse than any other version, right?
Mhm.
Uh, but somehow, against the odds, that's not the case here with Ace Combat 7.
Yes, and it was very surprising because this was not in a like Nintendo Direct. It was not promoted extensively. They seemed to announce it like maybe a month before it came out, maybe 2 months before it came out, in kind of like a very
Yep.
press releasey type form. I was not expecting much from this game, but yeah, it was really impressive. Just touching on the frame rate for a moment. The Xbox One S version, if you take a look at that, it is 60 FPS. It does target 60 FPS, I should say. Not is
Tries.
60
It tries.
FPS. It
It's definitely
tries.
not.
It's like often in the 40s, sometimes in the 30s. It's a bit
30s.
of a messy experience, and it runs
Yeah.
at 720p. Switch in docked mode is also 720p, portable 504p, so impressive turnout there. But it actually has a 1080p HUD on top of that, which
Yep.
the Xbox One version does not appear to have. So that's an interesting upgrade. But it is basic. It's a super smooth 30 FPS, like so smooth, so consistent. It is just almost locked. Like if you throw a ton of alpha out there, maybe it's gonna dip slightly for a moment, but it's super consistent, super consistent. So the performance side of things is really strong. In terms of the visuals, almost more than any other 8th gen port, it is Ace Combat 7. It just looks like the original totally. The critical visual elements like the cloud rendering, which looks amazing even still today. It looks
Still there.
fantastic here. It's not really significantly compromised in motion. It doesn't look significantly worse. You get terrain that stretches far into the distance, right? Now the LODs are pulled in a lot for things like trees, but you still get that
Yeah.
nice long draw distance for the things that matter. And you lose some arguably like nice to have post processing like SSAO and SSR, but the SSR in this game doesn't look very good, to be honest, and the
Nah.
SSAO isn't critical, right? So overall, it looks very similar. I mean, the cloud rendering in particular, I imagine they spend that a lot of time getting that up and running because it's just very impressive. And in their technical presentation, the clouds, I think they said it occupied up to 30% of GPU time on last gen consoles. So getting that on Switch must have been really tough. But yeah, just a super impressive port, I think.
I agree. I agree. And I'm happy to see it brought to the Switch, and hopefully more people checked it out on that console, because I myself was also like, there's no way to, like, what's the point of this port, right? Like, there's just flat out better versions to play. But it turns out there is a good purpose to it. And in fact, Ace Combat 7 in general is pretty, like, also the PC version, if you play, it's really good on like Steam Deck, for instance. So there's multiple good ways to play it portably, but seeing this running on the Switch definitely impressed me. So that's a good one. But it's not the only Unreal Engine 4 game to talk about, because there's at least two more, including our next one, which is Dragon Quest XI S. And oh boy, this is one of those, this is a really interesting example, because this is one of those games where they kind of almost went back to the drawing board to some degree to find ways to optimize the game for Switch that ultimately made it an overall better experience with a few compromises. So what I mean by that is that they actually went and they kind of redid a bunch of elements in the graphics. They simplified it somewhat to work on the Switch, but it still manages to look very much like Dragon Quest XI, right? It's just mainly like some of the texture details compromised. Some of the lighting stuff isn't quite the same, but just due to the nature of the game and the way it works, you don't actually necessarily even really notice it that much. You know what I mean? Like when you're playing it on Switch, it doesn't feel like you're playing a compromised version of the game. It just looks like Dragon Quest XI in your mind, right?
Yeah.
And it is UE4. It's a large open environment that you get to explore, although it's obviously divided up. The typical sacrifices, things like shadows as well occur there. But again, they just made all the right cuts that when you're actually playing it, it just winds up looking like Dragon Quest XI, you know?
Yeah, I reviewed your video in advance of this recording, and yeah, it is extraordinary the degree to which they've tweaked things, they've cut back models, they've like completely tweaked the way that indirect lighting looks. They've
Yep.
simplified textures. They've pulled in LODs. They've done things like you making the trees have like billboarded textures at a distance. You know, they do lots of little tricks and tweaks here to make the game run well on Switch. Although if you do compare them side by side, it's like, yeah, you see the differences, but
Yeah.
it's the Switch version in some ways looks different in an interesting
Right.
sense, and not
Exactly.
just worse, which is kind of, you know, interesting for a port of this magnitude. I think in this case, the Switch port is a little bit controversial because they actually ended up using the Switch
Yep.
port as a base for the re-releases of the game with the content in the Switch version, the definitive edition, I believe, which does mean that the lighting and model quality does take a bit of a hit in that version relative to the earlier, like PS4 release, say. It's a bit of an awkward situation where they developed the original version with one version of UE4, and they went over to another version of UE4 for the Switch version. Then, you know, are you really going to backport that like, it's just a big mess. So I understand why they did it. But
Yeah.
that one issue aside, which is sort of metatextual, I think they did a fantastic job with this. It really shows how far the Switch can be pushed if you give it proper care and attention. And it doesn't just like stick current gen quality assets in there, kill the post processing, and like slam the resolution to nothing,
No,
which is
no,
what
it
we see
doesn't.
with a lot of 8th gen ports. This is actually a very carefully done port that really respects the hardware and the audience, I think.
It was also interesting that the PS4 original was 30 frames per second, and so was this one. So it didn't
Yeah.
really feel like you lost any performance either.
Mm-hmm.
But I do agree with your point about ba- when they ported this version to all the other machines, including Xbox. This just kind of became the version of Dragon Quest XI, and it almost feels like the original, better looking version is it's not lost media or anything because you can still get it, but it's
Yeah.
starting to feel like that in a weird way, if you know what I mean, right?
Yeah.
Uh, Another thing they did for Switch is they did this before with Dragon Quest VIII, I think, on the US version for PS2, is they replaced the music with more orchestrated versions.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but frankly, I think the music in this game is pretty poor overall. Outside of maybe the main Dragon Quest theme, it just felt like Sugiyama and his
A little bit
company,
long
I
in the
guess.
tooth.
It's long in the tooth, and I really hope for whatever they do next for Dragon Quest 12. I would love for them to find a new musical style. They probably won't, but man, I would love that. But yeah, so definitely another one that's really quite good. And also, this game is awesome, by the way. I do, if you've not played through it, I highly recommend it on any version. The story is really great, and it's one of those games where it's like you think it's like, oh, okay, you're reaching the end point, and then some crazy shit happens, and you're like, oh, you know what I mean? And I'm a big sucker for that sort of thing where you really like, where it sort of flips things on its head and you get an unexpected twist. So there's some fun stuff like that in here. And it's an all around great classic RPG. Like really, really good. I think it's gotta be one of the absolute best in the entire Dragon Quest series, to be honest. So yeah, super, super cool. But our next game is also Unreal Engine 4. It's another impossible port, sort of. It's Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice, not Hellblade 2, obviously.
No.
I think Hellblade 2 is actually an impossible port. But Hellblade 1, on the other hand, well, here it is. It came to Switch. And who did this? Was this Virtuous again?
Q-Lock.
Right, Q-Lock. I always get those two
Mm-hmm.
confused. It was Q-Lock that did this one. And this is an interesting one. I rate this one a little bit lower than some of the other ones on this list. And part of the reason stems, so one of the sacrifices they had to make to get this to work on Switch is that they render out the cutscenes as video as opposed to displaying them in real time, which I don't like that. That always drives me nuts, but I understand why they had to do it. But aside from that, everything else about the port, it actually holds up really well, and it genuinely looks like Senua's Sacrifice. And in fact, playing this portably with a pair of headphones on, with that nice binaural audio, it's kind of like this cool, weird, fully enveloping experience within your head that's quite powerful for a portable system. but I guess why I waffle on this is I feel like it's a weird way to play a game like this on the Switch. So it is very impressive, but it's also
Yeah.
the sacrifices, Senua's sacrifices even are quite evident, don't you think?
Yeah, I would say so. One thing I would say in this port's credit is that it does basically deliver a very comparable is the wrong word. It's closer than that. It is very similar in a lot of respects to the original, just at a lower resolution. Like they're keeping some
Yeah.
of the lighting in there that you would often see cut. They're keeping the screen space reflections in there that you'd often see cut. It does look softer and quite a lot softer. And there
Yeah.
is that video
Quite.
file issue, but I think it looks quite good. It's an interesting way to play the game, and it's an interesting approach to tackling this game with the use of the pre-rendered video files, which is certainly a very novel technique to preserve some semblance of visual fidelity for those sequences, which are obviously very important, even if it isn't elegant exactly. There are all kinds of cuts here, like texture quality is in particular is kind of cut across the board as you might expect for a console with only 3 gigs of usable RAM. But I think it's an impressive port even still. Is it up there with like the very best we've seen on the system? No. But it is a fascinating little port and an interesting way to
Yeah.
play the game.
I think it's still good enough to be on this list though, because fundamentally when you look at it side by side with PS4, it actually looks really close. Like it looks like that game,
Yeah.
which is cool because it is a beautiful UE4 game. And like I said before, a lot of UE4 ports on the Switch, they just feel like they just crank things down until it ran, and you end up with something that just winds up looking ugly. And that's definitely not the case here. This does preserve the visual quality very well. So good job to Q-Lock on this one. But we have one more for the impossible port category, and I have not played this at all, so you're going to have to talk me through this one. But it's No Man's Sky. Obviously, this launched first on PS4, and what it is today is a completely different game. But as I understand, based on your video, they did some rather unique things in bringing this to the Switch.
So yes, I originally covered this back in 2022, and it had some problems visually, let's say. So it had some issues with like LODs, some poor shadow issues with pop-in, poor performance in general, especially when you're traveling around the planets at speed,
Right.
but especially perhaps poor image quality with a form of TA that didn't really do the image any favors. It was super shimmery and unstable. But the key development here, that original port I don't think was very special, but I wanted to put it on this list because of how much they improved it, because a little less than a year later, they added a proprietary version of FSR2 with a ton of changes, some specifically to reduce its memory bandwidth issues, which proved very expensive in its original incarnation when they ported it. And they managed to take No Man's Sky from some of the worst image quality on Switch to some of the best. It just looks super stable, super smooth in motion. It's very clean, a little soft, but it actually looks pretty good. And they also updated the game recently with the Worlds 1.0 update, which I checked out. And some of the visual features have actually survived the transition to Switch, surprisingly. So most notably, the water has a proper geometric surface now instead of just normal maps. Like it undulates up and down in a really convincing way. They don't port everything over with the water, like you don't get SSR, and the surface doesn't really change when you fly over it with your ship. And the flora on the planets also seems to have more variety. So there's a lot of stuff in terms of like the volumetrics that they haven't ported over, but in terms of that water, they did actually incorporate that water from the current gen versions of the game, which I think is kind of a cool touch, and it does look better. Unfortunately, there are still some problems, like the frame rate isn't great, the pop-in issues are still there, but the fact that it does look so much better, and the fact that the game is so ambitious to begin with and really seemed like the kind of project that would flail on the Switch, quite understandably, but it wouldn't do well. For a game this ambitious, I think it's a very good showing, and I think it deserves to be on this list, especially because, I remember kind of torching them for the image quality, and for them to come back 10 or 11 months later and just fix it is pretty nice. You don't see that often.
Right. I also want to quickly throw in, because it reminds me of this game, but I kind of want to throw in this into the ring before we get to the next topic, is
Sure.
Ark Survival Evolved.
Oh yeah.
Uh, I specifically want to highlight that because even though the end result is still doesn't run that great or anything, not that Arc ever did, let's be honest. But if you remember, that original version was largely pegged as like the worst port to Switch, at least at the time. It was a UE4 game. It was one of the worst looking things I've ever seen. It was basically unplayable, a complete mess. I did a rather comical video on it, I think, where I took the piss out of it. And it wasn't good, but then they actually took that to heart and they recruited in a new team at Grove Street Games to essentially rebuild the entire thing from scratch. They reported the game and it turned out like so much better. It's still maybe not qualified for this list per se, but I believe it deserves this little mention just because going all the way back and redoing something like that is just something you don't really see that often. It's similar to what happened with like Zone of the Enders, the second runner, back on PS Triple, where the initial high voltage version was just complete garbage, and they actually had Hexadrive report the game, and it was completely new and better. Similar thing. So all of those, a lot of Unreal Engine 4 in there for good reason, but that's kind of our impossible ports list. So based on those games though, Oliver, if you had to choose one as the one that stood out to you the most, is there any that you would single out?
Oh boy. Well, in terms of the impossible ports, just in terms of the one that scales best to the Switch, in terms of performance, in terms of maintaining visual features, in terms of looking good in its own terms, everything, I'd say Ace Combat 7 for me would be the highest.
Same for me. I agree.
But I mean, there are other ways to look at it. Certainly, like The Witcher 3 is super impressive for the scale and scope of that game. Dragon Quest 11 is like also extremely impressive just in terms of translating that without big cuts. I think there are different ways to look at it. For me, I'd kind of actually be inclined to say Ace Combat 7, but I could also see like Dragon Quest, for instance. I mean,
I agree. I could see any of them making the cut, but in terms of just preserving that experience and delivering something that's good on its own terms, I think Ace Combat 7 does the best. It really is a super impressive release. And they even put it out on a physical card, complete.
Oh.
Which is freaking cool. So like I feel like they gave it the deluxe treatment, surprisingly, and it's good. So yeah, Ace Combat 7, baby.